In the early 1970s, the Canadian psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, then a professor at the University of Virginia, received a letter that would change the course of his research. The sender was Reverend Harold J., a Methodist pastor from a small town in West Virginia. The content was unusual, but written soberly. His wife, Dolores J., had begun to speak fluent German during hypnosis sessions, despite never having learned the language. Stevenson was already known for his interest in cases that challenged the conventional understanding of the mind. Since the late 1950s, he had been collecting accounts from children and occasionally adults who claimed to remember past lives. Unlike mediums or spiritualists, his method was strictly empirical. Observe, record, and compare. For him, the inexplicable was not a reason for belief, but for investigation. In June 1970, intrigued by the Reverend's account, Stevenson traveled to Parkersburg, a small American town with a quiet atmosphere, surrounded by hills and wooden churches. He met the J couple in a simple house, typical of the rural middle class in the United States. Dolores, then 30 years old, suffered from chronic back pain after a domestic accident. Her husband, with basic training in therapeutic hypnosis, helped her relax through regular sessions. It was during one of these sessions that something unusual happened. In a deep trance, Dolores began to pronounce words that her husband did not recognize. He turned on the reel-to-reel recorder and continued observing. When the tape was listened to later, it was discovered that she was speaking German, and not modern German, but a 19th century variant, with an accent characteristic of the Baden-Baden region in southwestern Germany. Stevenson, accustomed to dealing with the extraordinary, maintained his skepticism. Upon arriving at the J home, he found Dolores already in a hypnotic state. Her breathing was calm, her gaze distant. Suddenly she spoke in a firm voice. "Ich bin Gretchen, Gretchen Gottlieb." She claimed her name was Gretchen, daughter of Johann Gottlieb, a cloth merchant. She described the smell of the linen and silk stored in her father's shop, the sound of carriages passing in the square, and even the shape of the windows of her house in Baden-Baden. During the session, Stevenson realized that the woman seemed to become another person. Dolores's American English disappeared, replaced by an upright posture, restrained gestures, and an almost aristocratic formality. He recorded everything. Listening again, he noted that the phenomenon went beyond mere curiosity. It was observable, repeatable, and subject to scientific study. In the following days, Stevenson returned several times, recording long hours of speech. He consulted specialists at the University of Virginia, who confirmed the authentic nature of the archaic German. No neighbor or friend recalled hearing Dolores pronounce even a single foreign word, and the woman herself, upon waking up, denied any recollection. "It's not me who's speaking," she said firmly. For Stevenson, that was the beginning of one of the most disconcerting investigations of his career, and perhaps the most documented manifestation of xenoglossy ever recorded in the West. In the weeks following the first session, Ian Stevenson remained in Parkersburg, staying in a small hotel near the Methodist church. Every morning, he went to the J couple's house, carrying a reel-to-reel recorder and a notepad. The atmosphere was always the same: closed curtains, dim light, and the gentle whirring of the machine. Dolores sat in the recliner, took a deep breath, and, under her husband's instructions, entered a trance. A few minutes later, the change was noticeable. The intonation, the rhythm, and even the body posture changed. When she spoke, it was no longer Dolores. It was Gretchen Gottlieb. "I'm back," she would say in German, naturally. Stevenson recorded everything, focused on the precision of the words. Although he did not master German, he recognized the fluency and syntactical coherence. There was something impressive about the spontaneity of that speech. It was not mechanical repetition, but a living discourse, emotionally integrated. Gretchen seemed like a real woman, with her own memories, habits, and feelings. When asked where she was, she replied with contained irritation, "What kind of question is that? I'm home in Baden-Baden." She then described the room she claimed to be in: walls with family portraits, a window facing a square, and the sound of carriages passing outside. Stevenson noted every detail, aware that the small descriptions could later be compared with historical records. Upon waking, Dolores returned to speaking English and remembered nothing. When she listened to one of the recordings, she was shaken. "That voice, it sounds like me, but it's not me," she murmured. "I don't understand a single word she's saying." Reverend Harold J. confirmed that in all their years of marriage, he had never heard his wife speak anything in German. "Nobody here speaks that language," he explained. "Not even foreign radio comes in well." Stevenson maintained a methodical approach. He checked Dolores's complete biography, family origin, schooling, friends, profession, no trace of German ancestry. He also examined the hypothesis of cryptomnesia, the unconscious recollection of something heard or seen in the past. But the evidence contradicted this idea. Dolores had grown up in the American countryside without contact with German culture, and the type of vocabulary that emerged in the trance was archaic, dating back at least 100 years. Intrigued, Stevenson sent excerpts of the recordings to the linguistics department at the University of Virginia. Preliminary analysis identified more than 800 different words, pronounced with a South German accent and correct grammatical structure. One of the specialists commented that certain expressions had been out of use since the late 19th century. The case ceased to be a curiosity and became a scientific enigma. Stevenson realized he needed to deepen the study. If the phenomenon was genuine, it required rigorous documentation. If it was not, he would have to find out where the error lay. In his field diary, he wrote, "The difference between faith and science lies in the method. My role is not to believe, it is to observe." At that moment, however, faced with the voice that cut across time, even the most disciplined reason began to wonder who, in fact, was speaking through Dolores J. Determined to maintain scientific rigor, Ian Stevenson decided to expand the observation of the phenomenon. He installed a small improvised laboratory in the J's own home, recorders, stopwatches, pulse sensors, and notepads. Each session was carefully recorded, always under the same conditions. Stevenson knew that any variation could compromise the validity of the results. The recordings showed an intriguing pattern. When Dolores entered a trance, her heart rate decreased, her breathing became deeper, and her facial expression subtly changed. It was as if another mode of consciousness took over. In one of the sessions, when asked about the date, Gretchen answered confidently, "It is spring, the year 1858. The psychiatrist began to realize that he was not facing a simple linguistic manifestation. There was a complete identity there, with coherent memories, emotions, and historical context. Gretchen spoke about her father, Johann Gottlieb, a cloth merchant in Baden-Baden. She mentioned the smell of linen stored on the shelves, the sound of the fountain in the central square, and even the taste of the bread her mother baked on Sunday mornings. Every detail seemed to come from a real memory, and not an invention. In search of confirmation, Stevenson invited two experienced linguists to analyze the material. The first was Dr. Günther Thomsen, a retired German philologist from Heidelberg University. The second, Dr. William Rogers, an American specialist in comparative phonetics. Neither of them knew the origin of the recordings. When they listened to the first tape, Thomsen interrupted after a few minutes and stated, "It's a dialect from southwest Germany, no doubt. Probably from the Baden-Baden region, and old." Rogers agreed. The grammar, intonation, and vocabulary corresponded to colloquial German of the second half of the 19th century. The specialists also noticed something more: the total absence of English interference. The speech flowed naturally, without the typical hesitation of someone trying to reproduce foreign sounds. "She is not imitating," Thomsen concluded. "She is speaking like someone who was born within that language." Stevenson recorded every observation. The more data accumulated, the more difficult it became to frame the case within conventional explanations. Dolores showed no signs of hysteria, nor did she seem to take advantage of the situation. On the contrary, she felt embarrassed and asked for the sessions to be stopped. "I don't want this to continue," she confessed to the researcher. "It's like a stranger is using my voice." For Stevenson, her discomfort was precisely what made the case stronger. Instead of enthusiasm, there was confusion and fear, authentic human reactions, far from any attempt at fraud. In the report sent to the University of Virginia, he summarized, "The phenomenon is observable, repeatable, and consistent. No psychological explanation so far is sufficient to describe it. The next step would be inevitable, to verify if between 1850 and 1860, a young woman named Gretchen Gottlieb had actually existed in Baden-Baden. If this woman had lived and died at that time, the enigma of Dolores J. would take on a new dimension. And it was precisely this search that led Ian Stevenson to cross the Atlantic towards Germany. In March 1971, Ian Stevenson landed in Frankfurt, carrying folders with transcripts, recordings, and detailed notes in his luggage. The objective was clear: to verify if Gretchen Gottlieb had actually existed. Unlike investigations carried out in villages in India or Sri Lanka, where many reincarnational memories were lost in oral tradition, here he had a fixed point: Baden-Baden, a German city of meticulous records, known for its elegance and bureaucratic precision. Upon arriving in the city, Stevenson stayed in a simple guest house near the Stiftskirche, the oldest church in the historic center. Walking through those cobblestone streets, surrounded by 19th century facades, was like penetrating the very landscape described by Gretchen during the trance. The squares, the distant bells, the murmur of the cafes, everything seemed to echo the memory of an era that somehow had manifested itself in an American woman of the 20th century. With the help of local researchers, Stevenson began examining civil and ecclesiastical archives. For days, he immersed himself in birth and death records written in brown ink, dated more than 100 years earlier. Finally, he found what he was looking for: a Gottlieb family, cloth merchants, and a daughter named Margarete, referred to in the family documents by the diminutive Gretchen. The record indicated that she had died in 1859 at the age of 16, a victim of respiratory complications. The name, the father's profession, and the location perfectly matched the descriptions made by Dolores in a trance. Stevenson spent a long time observing that aged paper, aware of the weight that a simple written line could have on the understanding of the human mind. He then decided to visit the street mentioned in the archives, where the Gottlieb family's old shop had been located. The building still existed, restored, and a small boutique occupied the space on the ground floor. Stevenson went in, observed the interior, and noted the dimensions. The arrangement of the windows and the view of the square were exactly as Gretchen had described. At night, in his hotel room, the psychiatrist wrote in his diary, "Coincidences exist, but they rarely organize themselves with such coherence. If Gretchen's memory emerged in Dolores's mind without prior contact, we are facing something that challenges the limits of human learning." Upon returning to the United States, Stevenson took authenticated copies of the German records. He showed the documents to Harold and Dolores J., who reacted with perplexity. "If this is true," the Reverend said, "then what we have here is greater than we can understand." Dolores remained silent. Stevenson did not jump to conclusions. He merely noted, "It is not appropriate to affirm identity between two people separated by a century, but there is sufficient consistency to demand scientific respect." At that moment, the J. Gottlieb case ceased to be a domestic phenomenon. It became an international investigation, observed with growing attention by linguists, doctors, and psychologists. And soon, the whole world would hear Gretchen's voice. In September 1972, the auditorium of the Society for Psychical Research in London was packed. Among those present were doctors, linguists, psychologists, and the curious, all attracted by a case that was beginning to circulate discreetly in American academic journals. Ian Stevenson stepped up to the pulpit with the calm of someone not seeking applause. He carried a portable recorder and a pile of typed reports. The title of his presentation was simple: A Study of Xenoglossy Under Controlled Conditions. When the lights went out and the recording began, a soft female voice was heard with a clearly German accent. "Ich bin Gretchen Gottlieb. Tochter von Johann. The sound filled the hall. The murmuring ceased. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Stevenson watched the audience carefully, not the sound, but the reactions. When the tape ended, he pressed the stop button and said calmly, "This woman does not speak German in her normal state, and yet you have heard her." The session ended in tense silence. Some scholars immediately got up to question the authenticity of the recording. Others, intrigued, asked for details about the method. Stevenson answered every question with clinical precision: dates, names, equipment, control of variables. There was no exaggeration or emotional language, just facts. A few weeks later, British and American newspapers began publishing reports about the woman who spoke German without having learned it. The case gained repercussion when the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany dedicated an entire page to the subject, reproducing excerpts from the linguistic analyses done in Charlottesville. The article questioned whether reincarnation could be a scientific hypothesis, but recognized the authenticity of the dialect and the phonetic consistency of the recordings. Stevenson, for his part, avoided interviews. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The phenomenon is real, but the meaning still escapes us. My role is to record with rigor, not to interpret with faith." While public curiosity grew, Stevenson turned to the more technical part of the investigation. With the support of his department at the University of Virginia, he began physiological examinations on Dolores during the hypnotic sessions. Using heart rate sensors and electroencephalograms, he found clear differences between the normal state and the trance state. The brain pattern changed. Alpha waves decreased and regions associated with speech showed intense activity. The data pointed to what Stevenson described in a report as a change in functional identity associated with cortical variation. In simple terms, Dolores's brain behaved like someone else's. In the last documented sessions, Gretchen described the moment of her death. She spoke in a weak, paused voice, describing a lung disease and the sensation of suffocation. Stevenson noted silently, observing that Dolores's breathing changed along with the account. The content is consistent with the biographical record of 1859, he wrote later. For the researcher, it was not about proving a belief, but about understanding a linguistic and psychological fact that defied conventional explanation. Every recording, every line of the report was a document. When he returned to Virginia, Stevenson knew that the case had gone beyond the boundaries of scientific curiosity. It was now part of the history of the investigation into the human mind, and one of the most enigmatic voices ever recorded on magnetic tape. In 1974, 4 years after the first meeting with Dolores J., Ian Stevenson published the book that would consolidate his name among the most controversial researchers of the 20th century, Xenoglossy, a review and report of a case. The title was technical, almost dry, but the content was fascinating. In it, the psychiatrist described step by step the investigation of the J. Gottlieb case from the first sessions in West Virginia to the linguistic analysis in Germany. The text was meticulous, free of spiritual speculations, written with the cold tone of someone describing an experiment. "This is not a study about faith," he said right in the preface. "It is a record of an observable fact whose nature remains unknown." The book quickly attracted international attention. Universities in Europe and the United States included it in seminars on psychology and linguistics. Critics praised the methodological precision, even while maintaining skepticism about the philosophical implications. For scientists, xenoglossy, the alleged spontaneous use of an unlearned language, was an uncomfortable field, neither completely rejectable nor totally explicable. Meanwhile, the press treated the case with an almost literary fascination. The story of the ordinary woman who, under hypnosis, spoke like a 19th century young woman in Baden-Baden had become a symbol of a mystery between science and soul. Radio programs in Germany and the United States reproduced excerpts of the recordings. Popular magazines published photos of Stevenson in his office, surrounded by tapes and transcripts. Dolores, on the other hand, reacted with discomfort. The press harassment made her isolate herself. In letters exchanged with Stevenson, she thanked him for the seriousness with which he had conducted the study, but asked not to be contacted again. "I just want this to end," she wrote in one of them. The scientist respected this. "Ethics," he noted in his diary, "must be above curiosity." Behind the scenes, Stevenson's laboratory in Charlottesville had become a center of international interest. Piles of tapes and reports filled the desks, and postgraduate students came from various countries to observe the collection closely. The psychiatrist reviewed every page, every transcript, with the patience of an archivist. What impressed him most, however, was not the repercussion, but the coherence of Gretchen's voice. The fluency, the vocabulary, the emotional stability. It was as if an entire identity was manifesting itself with autonomy. In a letter to Dr. J.P. Tart, Stevenson summarized the dilemma that would accompany him for the rest of his life. If a mind is capable of accessing a complete linguistic structure that it never learned, we are faced with something that goes beyond the current model of consciousness. I do not claim it is reincarnation, but it is memory, and all memory requires a subject. While the debate spread, the public was divided. For some, Stevenson had given reincarnation the first scientific treatment in history. For others, he had only documented a case of extreme dissociation. The researcher himself rejected both interpretations. "Science is not the place for certainties," he said in rare interviews. "It is the space for observation." The impact of the book crossed borders. In Germany, the J. Gottlieb case was adopted in comparative linguistics courses. In England, it generated debates among psychologists and theologians. And in the United States, it rekindled popular interest in unexplained mental phenomena. Stevenson, however, remained faithful to sobriety. He never presented Dolores J. as proof of anything. He preferred to call her an involuntary collaborator of a phenomenon whose explanation still escapes us. For him, the true legacy of the case was not spiritual, but methodological, to show that even the impossible can and must be documented with rigor. Between 1975 and 1977, the name Gretchen Gottlieb was already part of the German imagination. Magazines, radio stations, and television programs addressed the case as if it were a mirror of their own cultural history. In the middle of West Germany, a country that was rebuilding its identity after the war, the idea of a lost voice of the 19th century aroused as much fascination as discomfort. Programs on Bayerischer Rundfunk broadcast excerpts of Stevenson's recordings, followed by comments from linguists, theologians, and psychologists. Some called the phenomenon Sprachphänomen ohne Erinnerung, language phenomenon without memory. Others saw in it a clue about the survival of consciousness after death. The public, divided between skepticism and curiosity, followed every new article as if it were a chapter of a collective mystery. Stevenson observed everything from a distance, from his office at the University of Virginia. In a letter to a researcher in Freiburg, he wrote, "Popular enthusiasm is inevitable, but the scientist's task is to protect the data before it is corrupted by interpretation." Despite the caution, he recognized that the German interest was valuable. It was specialists from universities in Munich, Heidelberg, and Hamburg who helped preserve and authenticate the original tapes, ensuring that the voices of Dolores and Gretchen could be studied in high fidelity in the following decades. Professor Günther Thomsen, who participated in the initial analyses, published an article in 1976 titled Überlebende Sprache, Surviving Language. In it, he described the J. Gottlieb case as the most convincing manifestation of unacquired linguistic memory of the 20th century. The text circulated among universities and served as a basis for seminars on language and identity. Meanwhile, Dolores J. tried to resume her private life. The couple moved to Ohio, fleeing the attention of the press. Stevenson respected the silence, limiting himself to citing the case in conferences under the generic title Study of Xenoglossy Under Controlled Conditions. He never conducted sessions with Dolores again. Even so, the story gained new layers. In 1976, the Badische Tagblatt newspaper in Baden-Baden published a curious article: the discovery of an old tombstone in the Stiftskirche cemetery with the inscription Margaret Gottlieb, 1843-1859. The finding caused an uproar. For some, it was a mere historical coincidence. For others, the final link between two existences separated by a century. Questioned about the discovery, Stevenson replied with characteristic balance, "Coincidences exist, but when they repeat themselves with coherence and precision, they cease to be noise and become data." The answer was widely reproduced by the German press. In a short time, the case turned into the subject of documentaries, academic debates, and university theses. Channels such as ARD and ZDF broadcast special programs showing excerpts of the recordings and interviews with specialists. The public was divided between scientific rationalism and spiritual mystery, but everyone acknowledged one thing: no one had heard anything similar before. In 1977, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung published an editorial written by one of Stevenson's severest critics. The text, surprisingly, concluded with an admission. Ian Stevenson's contribution is to restore respect for observation. He obliges us to recognize that the unknown is also part of reality. In that same year, Stevenson consolidated a new field of research. The J. Gottlieb case began to be a reference in courses on anomalous psychology and cognitive neuroscience. For the first time, xenoglossy ceased to be a mere spiritualist curiosity to enter, cautiously, into scientific libraries. And ironically, the country that had provided the language to Dolores J's voice also became the guardian of its memory. In 1978, 8 years after the first meeting with Dolores J., Ian Stevenson was invited by the University of Edinburgh to participate in a symposium titled Memory and Identity. Where does the self begin? The auditorium was packed. Psychiatrists, linguists, theologians, and the curious occupied every seat, eager to hear the man who had investigated the woman who spoke German without learning. When it was his turn to speak, Stevenson walked slowly to the pulpit. He carried a pile of reports and the same reel-to-reel tapes recorded years earlier in Parkersburg. "I don't bring beliefs," he began. "I bring recordings." The audience laughed discreetly, but soon silence took over the room. The sound of the tape spinning filled the environment, followed by the clear and paused voice of a woman. "Ich bin Gretchen Gottlieb." That voice, recorded in 1970, now cut across the space of a Scottish university, more than 5,000 kilometers and a century away from Baden-Baden. Stevenson paused the tape and said, "This woman never studied German. She speaks with the accent and syntax of someone born in Baden-Württemberg in the mid-19th century." The question is not whether we believe this, but where this knowledge came from. For almost an hour, the psychiatrist presented data, graphs, and transcripts without resorting to mystical interpretations. He showed the phonetic analyses done by specialists in Germany, the neurological reports that indicated distinct brain patterns, and the civil records that confirmed the existence of a young woman named Margarete Gottlieb. In the end, he summarized the dilemma that guided his career. Faith seeks quick answers, science accepts endless questions. The phrase was met with contained applause, but it would echo in dozens of publications in the following years. Stevenson had achieved what few researchers of anomalous phenomena reach: academic respect, even among the skeptics. The conference was widely reported. Magazines such as Geopsychologie Heute and Der Spiegel published reports resuming excerpts from the book Xenoglossy, a review and report of a case. The German public was again divided between spiritual explanations and neurological hypotheses. For some, the case confirmed the possibility of reincarnation. For others, it represented only an enigma of the human mind. Stevenson, however, insisted that both readings were incomplete. "The mystery is part of the data," he stated in an interview with the BBC. "Denying it would be the same as denying the observation itself." While the case gained new life in Europe, Dolores J. remained silent, living discreetly in Ohio. Stevenson continued to cite her in conferences, but always with respect, calling her an essential collaborator, never a patient or study subject. In 1979, he granted a rare interview to the British programme Science and the Beyond on the BBC. When the reporter asked if he believed Dolores had been Gretchen, Stevenson replied, "We may never know. What I do know is that the voice exists, that the language is authentic, and that the phenomenon challenges everything we understand about memory. That is enough to justify the investigation." Shortly afterwards, the original tapes were duplicated and sent to the National Library of Germany in Frankfurt as part of an academic exchange. For Stevenson, the gesture had a symbolic meaning. In his diary, he wrote, "The voice returned to the place where it was born. Even if the body that pronounced it is another, the language recognized its origin. The memory found its echo." At that moment, the J. Gottlieb case ceased to belong only to science. It also became part of European culture, an unsettling testimony that perhaps the human mind goes beyond the limits of body and time. Between 1980 and 1987, the J. Gottlieb case came to occupy a unique space in the academic debate. It was no longer just a parapsychological curiosity. It became an inevitable reference in any discussion about consciousness, language, and memory. Universities in Germany, France, and England included Stevenson's study in courses on anomalous psychology, and new researchers began to revise his methods with the same experimental rigor used in traditional laboratories. During that period, Stevenson received dozens of letters from linguists, philosophers, and theologians. Some accused him of flirting with mysticism, others praised him for facing the unknown without resorting to faith. He responded to all with courtesy and a recurring phrase, "My job is not to define the origin of the voice. It is to demonstrate that it exists." In the United States, the book Xenoglossy was released in an expanded second edition. In Germany, it was translated and republished with the subtitle Die Frau, die Deutsch sprach, ohne es gelernt zu haben, The Woman Who Spoke German Without Having Learned It. The German public, especially theology and linguistics students, received the work with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Pride in seeing a fragment of their culture resurface in an American laboratory. Bewilderment at realizing that the scientific explanation still remained unattainable. In parallel, Stevenson deepened his neurological investigations. Reviewing the electroencephalogram readings taken during Dolores's trances, he noted consistent alterations in the areas associated with language and memory. The brain waves changed pattern with the same regularity observed in states of multiple personality, but without signs of pathology. It was, as he described it, a functional transformation of identity without emotional rupture. The recordings also revealed details previously unnoticed. In one of them, Gretchen sang an excerpt from an old religious hymn, So nimm denn meine Hände, So Take My Hands Then, composed around 1860. Stevenson, intrigued, sent the audio to a researcher in Freiburg, who confirmed the vocal arrangement corresponded to the way the song was sung in Protestant churches in the 19th century. It was unlikely that an American from the 1970s, without musical training or access to historical recordings, could spontaneously reproduce it. In 1982, the University of Tübingen organized a symposium titled Sprache und Erinnerung, Die Grenzen des Bewusstseins, Language and Memory, the Limits of Consciousness. The first panel was entirely dedicated to the J. Gottlieb case. Researchers presented new phonetic analyses and recognized that Gretchen's German had grammatical and morphological consistency compatible with native use in the 19th century. In the audience, a young philosopher named Karl Renz summarized the collective sentiment. Stevenson did not prove reincarnation, he proved something more important, that doubt is also scientific and that mystery is not synonymous with superstition. These words circulated in academic journals and became almost a motto for the new generation of scholars of the phenomenon of anomalous memory. Meanwhile, Dolores J. aged away from the spotlight, living a quiet routine in Ohio. In 1985, she sent a brief letter to Stevenson. Gretchen hasn't returned, but sometimes when I hear an old song, I feel like she is smiling. He filed the note among the case annotations without comment. For the psychiatrist, that simple sentence contained the essence of his research, the persistence of the memory, even when the subject does not know where it comes from. In the following years, Stevenson began organizing a new volume, bringing together European studies on the subject. He called it European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, and in it, he dedicated a chapter to Dolores J's case, not as proof, but as the most complete example of spontaneous xenoglossy ever documented. In a conference held in Berlin in 1987, he concluded with serenity, "Other cases may be more verifiable, but none speaks so directly to the human heart as the one in which a voice crossed time and found refuge in another body." The audience remained silent. Doubt, as Stevenson had taught, was the starting point and not the end of scientific discovery. In the early 2000s, long before his death in 2007, Ian Stevenson would often return alone to his office at the University of Virginia, open the metal cabinet, and pull out the old reel-to-reel tapes from the J. Gottlieb case. He would turn on the recorder and let the sound fill the room, the soft, almost shy voice saying in 19th century German, "Ich bin Gretchen Gottlieb." For him, that sound summarized a lifetime of research. For more than half a century, he had investigated hundreds of cases of spontaneous recollections, of children who claimed to remember other lives, and of adults who manifested memories impossible to explain. But nothing touched him as much as that voice of an American woman who, without knowing a single word of German, spoke like someone from another time. "Science is not made of answers," he wrote in one of his last notes. "It is made of faithful records, so that others may understand in the future what we only intuit today." Dolores J's case became a permanent part of the university's collection, preserved under controlled temperature, with revised transcripts and official translations. In Germany, copies of the tapes were deposited in the National Library in Frankfurt, symbolically completing the cycle of a voice returning to its homeland. Between 2000 and 2005, the case was debated again in BBC and ZDF documentaries, now from a historical perspective. Young neuroscience researchers tried to reinterpret the phenomenon in light of discoveries about brain plasticity and implicit memory. No explanation, however, could answer the central question: how could someone express vocabulary, accent, and linguistic patterns of an era they had never lived? Dolores, already elderly, wrote one last letter to the university team. The shaky handwriting still conveyed serenity. "Gretchen hasn't returned, but sometimes I dream of her walking in an old square. I feel she is at peace." Stevenson never replied. His health no longer allowed for long correspondences, but he kept the note alongside the original annotations, marking it with a simple word: final. Even after his death in 2007, Ian Stevenson's name remained linked to a concept that crossed generations: the continuity of memory. For him, reincarnation was never a certainty or a dogma, just a working hypothesis. What moved him was something simpler, and at the same time, deeper: the conviction that the human spirit still holds unknown territories. In the following years, the J. Gottlieb case continued to be studied in universities of linguistics, psychology, and theology. In 2010, the Freiburg Institute for Consciousness Studies held a public listening of the restored recordings. At the end of the exhibition, the event coordinator summarized the general feeling in a few words: "Regardless of the explanation, the sound of these tapes reminds us that the human mind is greater than we understand." Today, decades later, the story of Dolores J. and Gretchen Gottlieb remains alive, not as proof of life after death, but as a symbol of the human capacity to seek meaning in the inexplicable. Ian Stevenson left a legacy of disciplined skepticism, the idea that investigating the mystery is not believing in it, but honoring the doubt itself. His final phrase, found in a draft dated 2006, seems to conclude not only the case, but his entire journey. Truth does not fear mystery, it documents it. And that is why, even today, in the recordings stored in Charlottesville and Frankfurt, Gretchen's voice continues to echo. A memory without origin, a language without a teacher, a record that defies time and silently obliges us to listen.